Perhaps you've heard your English teacher rail about using active versus passive voice, and it is an important topic for writing and for style and all those kinds of issues. On the SAT, it's not super important, but it does come up occasionally, and we should know the basics of why passive voice isn't really as good as active voice in many cases. So, what is the deal with active and passive voice? Well, if you remember way back when I was talking about subjects, I said that the subject of a sentence is almost always or often the thing doing the action. It's the agent. But I said there it's not always true, and this is why it's not always true, because sometimes the subject of a sentence is not necessarily the agent, aka the doer or the beer of an action. Sometimes the subject is acted upon by another agent or by the agent, which may be named or unnamed. So basically, if you look at the active voice, the subject of the sentence is the agent, aka the thing doing the action, and this is your active voice. So Chris hit the ball. Chris is our subject. He's also the agent because he's doing the hitting of the ball. Whereas if your direct object is the subject, this is where you get the passive voice. So for example, very similar to this sentence, the ball was hit. So notice the subject is the ball, but the ball was not the agent. The ball was not the thing doing the hitting. The ball was this thing being hit. So what we've done is we've rearranged the original. We've taken the ball, which before was the direct object, made it the subject, and then formed the passive voice form, which we'll talk about in a second, and that makes the emphasis of the sentence on the direct object, on the subject, in this case, the ball. Notice we could, in theory, add by Chris to show who did the hitting, so who the agent was, but it is optional. We don't need it for this to be grammatically correct, whereas here we do need the agent because the agent is a subject. Another example, the philosophy department is run by Billy Bob. So notice here, the philosophy department is the subject, but it is not the thing doing the running. It is the thing being run. And then here's our agent by Billy Bob. Another example, the cities were destroyed in a series of bombing raids. The cities is our subject, were destroyed. Here is our verb, but notice the cities aren't doing the destroying, they are being destroyed. So this is the passive form of this sentence. Notice here we don't have an agent, though we can infer it from some of the other information in the sentence. So to form the passive voice, you have your noun, obviously, which is your subject. Then you use a form of to be, so either is, are, was, and were, depending on the number and the tense. And then you use the past participle, so were destroyed, was hit, is run, and so on. Now on the SAT, active or passive voice, as I said, is not tested directly, though the SAT will prefer the active voice, mostly because the active voice produces shorter sentences. And as I've said in other places for the improving sentences, more concise answers, all things being equal, are generally correct. Whereas passive voice generally produces wordy choices. So when you see wordy errors, sometimes it's because it's a passive sentence, and the way to fix it is to make it active. Now, in real life, it really matters for various reasons, not only because of style, but also because of what the passive voice leaves out. So this is a very famous phrase that you see in a lot of places, like corporations send out memos when something bad happens, governments, and they include phrases like mistakes were made. So what's the problem with a sentence like mistakes were made? Well, the problem is who made the mistake, right? And when you use the passive voice, you leave out the agent. Sometimes that can obfuscate what is going on here, right? So if I want to apologize without actually apologizing, I could say something like, mistakes were made. Obviously leaving open the question, by whom? By the CEO? By the CFO? Like who, right? Who made the mistakes? So generally, active voice is preferred, but there are situations where passive voice is actually better. So it's preferable when style, clarity, or expediency dictates. And I won't go into examples here. It's not relevant for the SAT. Just keep in mind that often teachers will tell you don't use passive voice, use active voice, and that's generally true, but there are situations where passive voice is actually preferable. But for the SAT, remember, passive voice makes wordy sentences, which are generally wrong for the SAT, whereas active voice makes more concise sentences, which the SAT generally prefers.